Absolutely, yeah.
So would you like to just explain a bit about yourself first, just so we know?
Okay, so my name's Dr. Neil Holden. I'm a virologist and expert in lung diseases. I work in the School of Life and Environmental Science. I have to remember the new name because we've just changed our school name. And I'm a senior lecturer there, and I teach a number of different subjects, but one of the main things I teach is virology, both to undergraduates and master's students. And it's one of my sort of scientific passions is understanding viruses, but also actually communicating my knowledge of viruses to the general public and to anyone I can, basically.
The perfect person for this this Q&A. So the first question is, what is Omicron?
Okay, so the word Omicron gets back, there's been a lot in the news, and you often hear, variant Omicron. So to explain that a little bit more, we need to think about what these terms actually mean. So COVID-19 is the name of the disease. So that stands for Coronavirus Infectious Disease 2019. So that's when it first arose. That disease is caused by a virus called SARS-CoV-2. Now, SARS-CoV-2 is part of the coronavirus family of viruses. That's a massive family of viruses. So there's a huge number of different coronaviruses, some of which can cause common cold in humans, but some of which cause very severe respiratory disease. There was a disease called SARS in the early 2000s. There's also a disease called MERS in around 2010. Those are all coronaviruses. And there's also a huge number of different coronaviruses that can infect other animals. So pigs, cattle, all have different coronaviruses that can infect them. So SARS-CoV-2 is the coronavirus that it causes COVID-19. Now, when coronaviruses replicate in the body, in our cells, then they're not always the best at replicating. So what happens is when they're replicating and making more and more viruses, sometimes they make mistakes. And these are called mutations. Now, those mutations can be very, very minor, as in they can just sort of slightly change things. Just, if we're thinking about some of the proteins that make up the virus, they can just slightly change the shape of that protein. Now, what that really means is that that protein might no longer be as recognized by our immune system. So maybe they can spread to people that have already had coronavirus and don't have, no longer have an immune response against the new variant, as it were. So it's just a little differences between these viruses that make them variants. Okay.
So what does the booster do?
So the booster vaccine gives your immune system a bit of a reminder of what it's looking out for. So unfortunately, in general, coronaviruses aren't very memorable for your immune system. So your immune system builds up a response against coronaviruses when you have an infection, but over time it starts to disappear and wane and go away. The booster basically gives your immune system a little reminder, and basically what it's doing is it's introducing the spike protein that's on the outside of the coronavirus into your body without the actual virus. So it's just literally the protein from the coronavirus. And basically your immune system sees it, it recognizes it, and it gives that immune system a bit of a boost so that if you do encounter the coronavirus, that your immune system is primed and ready to stop that virus before it can cause a new infection.
So speaking of preventing infections, how effective are face coverings?
So face coverings are one of a number of measures that were adopted fairly on in the pandemic. Basically, the major way in which this virus spreads is via respiratory droplets coming out of your mouth when you're talking, when you're coughing, all those kind of things. So face coverings are actually best at preventing those respiratory droplets coming out of the infected people and spreading to other people. So by us all adopting these face coverings, we're basically protecting each other. And by stopping those respiratory droplets from spreading, you don't necessarily know. You could have an infection and be asymptomatic. And so basically by sort of all adopting their face masks, we're preventing the virus from spreading amongst the population.
It's the idea of being one community, isn't it? So
Yeah.
we're all in this together.
Exactly.
Can you still get COVID even if you're fully vaccinated and fully boosted? Boosted isn't a word. Vaccinated.
If you've had your, yeah. So yes, we know there are what we call breakthrough cases, particularly with things like Omicron, which does contain mutations of that spike protein, which means that the vaccine, although it is protective, isn't fully recognizing that new variant. Now, the good news is that being vaccinated, whilst it might not completely protect you against infection, massively reduces the chances of severe infection. So we know that people who have been vaccinated are far more likely to have either asymptomatic or very, very, very mild symptoms compared to unvaccinated people, who are much more likely to require hospitalization and ventilation and all those kind of things. So having the vaccine, whilst it might not completely protect you against being infected, does massively reduce the symptoms and the severity of the disease, but also, more importantly, it can also reduce the amount of virus given off by someone who is infected. So the amount of virus that they can spread is reduced, and it does protect you. It does give you some protection, and you are less likely to catch the coronavirus, but not completely invulnerable from the virus.
I suppose no measure can be 100%.
No,
because
exactly.
of the nature of it changing and mutating. Will future booster jabs be needed, or will this be the last one?
Almost certainly, because of that nature of the coronavirus, in that it's easily forgotten by the immune system, it is very likely that we will need boosters in the future, both to give our immune system a little bit of a boost, but also to fight any new variants that do potentially come up. However, the likelihood is that those booster vaccines will probably only be needed by those people who are clinically vulnerable. So those kind of people that receive the influenza vaccines at the moment, so the very old, the very young, and people with underlying health conditions such as asthma, COPD, diabetes, and those kinds of diseases. So yes, boosters are probably going to be continually needed, but probably not for the whole population. It probably will be more directed to people who are more vulnerable to the virus.
Thank you. Moving away from vaccinating and turning towards testing, when should someone get a PCR test as opposed to an LFD or an LFT test?
Okay, so we know that guidance is continually changing on this. So the current guidance is that you only need a PCR test if you're symptomatic. Okay. You don't need a PCR test if you're asymptomatic and have a positive LFT or LFD, whichever you want to call it. And nor do you need a PCR test if you've just been in contact with someone who is positive either. So at the moment, the guidance is that you only need a PCR test if you do have symptoms. Mostly that is because scientists and the people who are really monitoring this really want to monitor things like what variants are out there, what's causing the infections and all those kinds of things. So it gives really great data on that side of things as well.
Where can students pick up tests, or where should you go for a test?
Okay, so the LFT and LFD tests are widely available, both on campus and off campus. So on campus, they're available from the Student Advice Centre in the Students' Union. They're available from the Student Wellbeing Centre. They're available from Student Support in Minerva, and they're also available from the library. Off campus, you can go onto the government website and have them sent to you in the mail. You can also pick them up in pharmacies and potentially other places as well. In terms of PCR testing, the major one is actually on campus. It's actually right where I'm based, which is in the Joseph Banks laboratories. So it's just opposite where the B&Q is, and basically it's in the car park of the Joseph Banks building there, and you can book that PCR testing. I think there probably is other PCR testing places as well, depending on where you live. Obviously, if you're local but don't live in Lincoln, it's relatively easy to find where your local PCR testing is by going on those government websites.
The big question next, the big, probably unanswerable to a certain extent question of, will there be another lockdown?
Yeah, and I think that's a lot on everyone's mind. Every time we hear about new regulations and things like that, there is that wondering of, of whether there will be any lockdown. And, I think over the last 2 years, again, we've been through a lot and we've been through these lockdowns, and it is, I think a lot of people's fear is that there could be another lockdown. In my personal opinion, and this is only my personal opinion, it is unlikely. However, where we might see a new lockdown is if a variant did arise that did spread, very rapidly amongst the population and did cause very severe disease, which would then obviously put burdens on the NHS and put, potentially have massive sort of problems throughout the country. Then I could see a new lockdown coming in. However, I think that is relatively unlikely. All the data suggests at the moment that we are moving towards the virus becoming endemic, and potentially the severity of the disease does seem to be lower than it was previously. And we do see that with viruses in general, is that as time goes on, we do see some things like the severity of the disease that can be caused changing and becoming lower amongst the population.
So speaking of variants, will they always be a problem?
Again, looking into my crystal ball and, making a prediction, and it is only a prediction, and again, completely my own personal opinion, is that it probably is likely, if this virus does go endemic and is around, in the future, that we will get slight different variations of the virus. Like we do with the influenza virus that causes the flu. So every year you need, those people that have influenza vaccines, you have a one every year, because the influenza virus changes slightly over the year and you have different variants of the influenza virus. And the same will probably be true of the coronavirus. However, again, the likelihood is that, boosters and all those kind of things probably will only be needed for those clinically vulnerable people. So hopefully, again, we won't see a variant arising that does cause, severe disease and is widely spread amongst the population. But it could happen, but I personally think unlikely.
You mentioned earlier about how the virus is actually spread, but is it possible to catch it from surfaces, like instead of the air?
Yes. So the data on this has been it's been a bit controversial with some different results out there, but all of the latest data suggests that yes, you can catch the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, from surfaces. However, the likelihood is much, much lower than catching it with through respiratory droplets. So basically what happens is that when you do things, if you're infected and you touch your mouth or you sneeze into your hand or those kind of things, and you touch a surface, that some of those droplets and some of those things are left on the surface, and the virus can survive on those surfaces for a time. It does depend on what the surface is. So different surfaces the virus will survive on for different lengths of time, whether it's porous surface or non-porous surface and all these kinds of things. But it does seem possible that you can pick it up from those surfaces. But again, the likelihood of you doing that is far lower than if you, basically are in the vicinity of someone who has the virus and is, coughing and talking loudly and all those kinds of things.
Thank you. We mentioned earlier about the idea of being in one community and we're all in this together. And linking to that, can you see any positives that have come up from the last 2 years in terms of the pandemic?
Yes, I can actually. And whilst I know that we're all, there has been massive massive negatives with the pandemic, and there's been a lot of tragedy with this pandemic. But certainly, in terms of the science, things like the emergence of the messenger RNA vaccines the ones that were made by Pfizer and Moderna, that technology is groundbreaking and could potentially be used for vaccines against many future different infectious diseases. So there's talks of it potentially helping with things like HIV, with malaria, with other infectious diseases as well. But also potentially that technology could also be used to help do things like help protect people against certain cancers and other things. So that's a massive breakthrough, the use of that technology. I think the other thing is the thing that you alluded to, that one community spirit, and that's been very evident both in the population as a whole, but also in collaborations between scientists and companies and all these kind of things that have put aside sort of the old long-standing competitiveness and have actually come together and prioritized things like producing new treatments, to testing these things, to really, and we've really seen, that a lot of the vaccines and a lot of the treatments, they've gone through exactly all the same regulatory testing that any other treatment has done, but really, because of the number of people working on this all together, it's been massively more effective.
Second to last question now. This is relating to long COVID. Can you still be vulnerable to long COVID without being particularly vulnerable to severe COVID? It's a bit of a...
Yeah. So unfortunately, there is a lot we still need to understand about long COVID. Long COVID is still a bit of a mystery out there. There's a lot of suggestions out there. One thing we don't know is every long COVID the same? Is the underlying reasons for long COVID the same in every single person? Almost certainly the answer is going to be no. So one person's long COVID could be very different from another person's long COVID. So trying to understand really what's going on there is very, very difficult, because we've got all these different sort of variations on long COVID as well. There does seem to be a bit of a correlation between the severity of the disease and the likelihood of long COVID. So I think if you've had more severe COVID-19, you're more likely to have long COVID. However, that's not to say that if you've had very mild COVID, you won't get long COVID at all. We know there are some people out there who might have had very mild disease who still are having some sort of symptoms, very sort of feeling tired, potentially changes in their sense of smell and their taste and all those kind of things, and even more severe things going on. So it is possible, but I think it's more likely if you've had more severe disease.
The final question now that we've had sent in before, but as I said before, if you have any questions, do put them in the comments and we'll mention them. What can students do to help?
So the one thing that students can really do to help is the same thing I think that we all need to do to help this, and that is actually, go with the guidance that's been suggested out there. So, hands, face, space. So washing your hands regularly, wearing a mask where needed, and, giving some social space. So those are, the massive help. Other thing that students can do is obviously also get vaccinated if you can. And that's also going to be, not just helpful to yourselves. You're not just protecting yourselves, you're also protecting the population as a whole. You're protecting the vulnerable and all these kind of things. You're making it much less likely that a new variant is going to rise, because if we have a lower amount of virus in the population, the chances of new variants arising is much lower. Okay, but again, I really want to sort of shout out to all the students who have stepped up and helped in many different ways over the pandemic as well. So we know students have been volunteering in vaccination centres, in testing centres, who have been doing massive amounts of work, who have really stepped up and taken on and even those students who have just got through this. I think basically we all deserve a bit of a pat on the back after the last 2 years, and the resilience that the students have shown to the changes in regulation, to adopting things like online learning, things like that, has been fantastic, and it is greatly appreciated. And we do understand that this has been a very, very stressful time, and I think our students have really shown just how fantastic they are.
I'd like to give a thanks to the staff as well, and people like yourself who are dedicated to sharing your knowledge, so that we're all a little bit less confused and scared, and can be better prepared. We're going to finish and wrap things up now. If you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, or any that you think of as soon as the stream ends, I often do that. The Q&A ends and you think, oh, I should have answered that. So just send them through if you have any questions, and we'll pass them on to Dr. Neil Holden, and we'll get the answer out to you. So brilliant. Is there anything you'd like to say? Any final comments?
I think, really my one sort of strong passion is that, I want you guys to, make use of, the experts around you. You're surrounded by experts, and we are a one community. We are all in this together, at this university. And so again, if you see me wandering around and you want to ask me a question, feel free to approach me. If you want to send me an email and things like that and ask me a question, it doesn't have to be about SARS-CoV-2. It can be about other viruses or other things. I will try my best to answer it. And I always think, if I don't know the answer, I'll go away and I'll look it up and all those kind of things. So, please, feel free to, if you do have questions, things like that, just feel free to ask us. Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you for coming and answering questions.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed and hope you've learned something. Thank you.